Okay, so good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Bob Bruner. I am the A&R Extension Educator for Clay and Owen counties. This is one program and one series of programs, because it's the first of three, that I always give, in part because there are so many ponds in the area where I work. So Owen County, there is virtually a pond on every single property, and there are many natural springs throughout the area. And Clay County also has its fair share. I also have some experience in pond ecology. I've done pond ecology work before, including the insect work and plant work in them. So I've got a little bit of background on this, and I like to share that to try to help people understand a little better about how they can take care of their ponds. So let's go ahead and dive into this one. So tonight's is ponds. What's the weed? A little bit on weed, a few different weedy species, and mainly go over the overarching groups of weeds that may be affecting your ponds. I've got some control information included with each one, which is, I know, something that all of you are going to be really interested in. So there are a lot of different kinds of weeds that are going to have a serious impact on your pond. Some of them are going to be easier to deal with than others. And unfortunately, they all can't be simply treated in the same way as in you're just pouring a chemical into your water and hoping the weeds go away. There are different things about how we can try to manage them. Unfortunately, a lot of the weeds in our ponds are invasive, meaning we accidentally or intentionally put them there. This also means that they very, very readily spread to different bodies of water. Now, a lot of weedy species in ponds aren't invasive and can very easily spread as well. So I'm going to go over as many of the different kinds as I can in the time we have. So let's look at a few types of weeds. So one great set of people who work at Purdue Extension put together some information on it, and they came up with these few different categories: algae, submerged, free-floating, root-floating, and emergent weeds. The differences between all of these different types of weed is a lot of their different structures and how they do things. So do they flower? Do they take in oxygen at the air-water interface, or do they absorb it under the water? Is there a root structure? Because many of these will not have roots. And if so, what structure do those roots take? What kind of depth do they occupy? Because many plants will occupy the entirety of a water column, while some of them may only occupy the very surface at the air-water interface. And then, of course, how close are they to shore? Are they freely floating in the middle of the pond, or are they sticking very close to the shore? Or are they just swept there by the water currents? Now, tonight, what I'm going to do is I'm primarily going to focus on algae, free floating, and root floating. And I've got a decent piece of information on submerged plants as well. I just forgot to highlight that one when I made the slide. So we're going to go over plants that occupy that category. Now, there's a lot that can be said about emergent plants, but many of those plants may not necessarily be what I'd call strictly aquatic. So maybe in a future program, we can go over those a little more closely. But if you have questions on something that isn't covered tonight, go ahead and ask me later or send me an email. We can make sure we talk about it. All right, so let's dive in. Algae. This is perhaps the #1 offender when it comes to pond weeds. Now, this isn't a plant. Algae is its own kind of organism. It is very, very closely related to plants. They will photosynthesize, they will respirate just like plants do. They just don't share quite the same biology. They are non-flowering, so what you're going to see is just groups of green stuff, sometimes forming in filaments, sometimes forming in big colonies that you can see. We occasionally refer to algae seen on the surface of a pond as pond scum due to an oily sheen they will leave on the surface of the water. But note this is actually important. It's not just algae that does this. So if you have a surplus of aquatic organisms called plankton and they die, when they die, they rise to the surface of the water and they will also leave an oily sheen. So that's why it's important to make sure you get things properly identified before you consider treatment. Biggest things that we typically see are that algae will form this gigantic mossy patch over a great deal of the surface of the water. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen that before as you've been dealing with your algae issues. So a little bit closer now, microscopic green algae is one of the most common kinds of algae that we have in our water, and it's the most important. We see this as a weed. However, this algae is actually a very critical portion of the food chain in a pond. This is going to act as food for fish and insects that are going to be necessary for a healthy ecosystem. The trouble is what we run into is when these populations of this stuff grow into large populations, they just explode into something we call an algal bloom. Now, I mentioned a bit about the food source already. They can also turn your pond water green. Now, here's the thing. This is an important distinction. When they turn your pond water green, they are doing so under the surface of the water, not on the surface. So if you just took a cup right through the pond and set it down, you would see this vague green tint throughout all the water in the cup. Now, here's the thing. That's not necessarily bad. It depends on what you're wanting. If I go to a client's home and they want me to look at their pond and I can see straight through the pond all the way to the bottom, and they're worried about like their fish and other things, I would say they have a major problem. You need this stuff in your water if you want an active ecosystem with fish and other things. You want to make sure it doesn't get too great of an issue. If it is completely obscuring the bottom of the water and you can't see anything swimming around in there for all the algae, then you have a moment where you have a problem. So I'm going to move on to the next algae that we're going to discuss, and I've got some control information after a couple more slides, so bear with me. This is also an important example of algae, blue-green algae. This is one that I do see fairly regularly, especially after, say, rains like we're about to get tomorrow evening. Blue-green algae also goes by another name referred to as cyanobacteria. So what this is that it is a type of organism that is a very green color often. Sometimes that color can vary. And if you see it on your pond, it's going to look just like that previous image. It's going to look like someone dumped green paint on your pond. It's going to stay at the surface and it's going to be a little bit through the water column as well. Now, the cyanobacteria aren't producing a toxin themselves. They're not just spreading toxin in your water. But what happens is when they die, when their bodies begin to decompose, that releases a toxin. So you may go out to your pond one day, you'll smell this rather sewagey smell, and your dog will hop in the water. Well, when your dog hops in, it breaks apart and kills all these algae, and that releases that toxin, and now your dog is very, very ill. When you have a blue-green algal bloom, that's actually kind of a dangerous situation. You and your companion animals and livestock shouldn't go anywhere near that water. Now, what's going to happen is that blue-green algal bloom is going to persist, and then it's suddenly going to die out as their populations reach too big of a point where they can't support themselves. Now, you may think that your water is cured after that point. Well, you need to wait a little longer because the toxins created by blue-green algae will persist in the water because they all died, they all broke apart and released the toxin. You need to wait a few days so the sunlight can do its work and break that down, and then your water will most likely be safe enough to re-enter, though I would consider getting some water testing done if that's an option for you. Now, a way that you can prevent both blue-green and green algae, if you're getting large blooms of them every year, first step, check your septic system. That's going to be a high nitrogenous input, and if it's leaking into your pond or a local water source, that's going to be why you're seeing these blooms occur. You also should consider employing some kind of conservation structure that involves like a grass-lined ditch or plantings that are going to act as a filter for nitrogen runoff that's coming into your pond. Those plants will absorb it and prevent it from getting into the water, or at least a large amount of it from getting in the water. And that way you won't have to deal with an algal bloom. Last thing you can try to do is avoid using fertilizer during certain times of the year, basically right now. Avoid the fertilizer, avoid mowing near the water, so that way you're not just getting all these cut up plant parts and fertilizer, which are carrying nitrogen and other things to go into your water. You can also, as I mentioned, begin planting things. Using native wetland plants around the edge of your pond is going to help you create a natural filter that's going to prevent these blooms from happening. As for control, there aren't many things recommended to control cyanobacteria because it does tend to burn itself out and it is toxic, so you don't want to go near it. However, with the green algae, the microscopic algae, when it gets too intense, there are a few products such as inert dyes and other things you can put in to try to reduce that population. So one last group of algae I'm going to mention here, filamentous algae. You may have seen this funny brown filament-like stuff in your ponds called horsehair algae, which belongs to this group. They all act pretty much the same. Filamentous algae can form a really thick mat on your pond or in your pond, and it can make it really challenging to remove them. Sometimes it can get so thick you could practically walk from one end of your pond to the other with barely sinking in an inch. This is an act of trying to remove them, can be backbreaking labor, and so you don't want to let this stuff sit. It can spread across large areas of your pond very, very quickly. So when you have high temperatures and a good amount of nitrogen entering the water, this is that moment where filamentous algae can grow really, really quickly. However, the good thing is that they do respond to different chemical control options. Though if you're someone who likes to stock fish or in your ponds, that can make it a little bit of a challenge. Usually I find that in my client's experience, when you do a chemical control or a dye control option, it will take time for it to really take effect. Now, a little bit on the management. I put here filamentous algae management, but really this kind of goes for all of them. So the amount of sunlight and nutrients that are entering the pond are going to affect algae just like they would with plants. Algae is photosynthetic, meaning the more sunlight, the more energy it has, and the nutrients are going to provide it the building blocks to grow. So if you have lots of sun and lots of nutrients, you're going to have an algal bloom. It's going to make it spread very, very quickly. Something you can try to do early on in the season, say around March and into April, is you can put an inert dye into your pond that will begin to cut off sunlight to the algae as it's developing. However, it will not affect algae that is already on the surface. This is intended for those plants that are already under the surface of the water. When it comes to a straight up herbicidal chemical, copper sulfate is by far the most commonly used one. However, you can also use chemicals like copper chelates or sodium carbonate peroxyhydrate, which will interrupt certain things with the plant's development and ability to create food. And however, the big problem is that the most commonly used product, or copper sulfate, is also lethal to trout and several other fish species. So if you use it, you have to be prepared for a fish kill to happen. And that you can even have that happen when you follow the label directions exactly on it. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. However, it is generally effective when it comes to algal control. Okay, so one last little algae plant I'm going to mention here is called chara or starwort. So these are actually fairly common plants. You can even put them in your aquariums. And I actually like these plants quite a bit because they provide, you can see there in that bottom right-hand image, they provide habitat for our fish. The big problem is when they get to be too many of them. Now, I don't see that very often, but some people like to keep them out of their ponds for aesthetic purposes. I personally don't think that's a good idea. However, I do understand that some people like different purposes for their ponds, and that's entirely your call. So chara, sometimes they're called starwort, skunkweed, or muskweed. And the reason for that is that if the water level falls below the point where it's suddenly exposing the chara to the air, it has a very musty smell and it can make it undesirable. So you think of later in the season when your pond begins to dry some and that starwort gets exposed, then it's going to have that really nasty smell to it. Now, chemically, you can control this very similar to other algae, but personally, I don't recommend it. I can think that hand removal is actually fairly doable with these. They're not deeply rooted in any sense. They should be relatively easy to pull out. However, I think it's far better to try to do something to control the runoff that's entering your pond. So for example, those moments when you can try to put in plants that are native wetland plants to create a filter, or put in some kind of ditch in the direction of the runoff to try to collect it and begin to strain it out and prevent major issues from happening. That's my thoughts on the best way to try to control this plant. So before you decide to spend $200 to buy copper sulfate, consider doing these things first. All right, so we're going to move on now. Oh, I wanted to go over this one last time, sorry. Before we move on, so a few chemicals that you can use for the control of algae. I've mentioned copper sulfates, copper chelates. Diquat is also an option, as well as sodium carbonate peroxyhydrates. All of these will have labels on them, and if you choose to use them, please follow the label. It is the law, and some of these may be in a little bit of short supply. I haven't checked recently to see if they're being impacted by any of the supply strains that we've experienced recently. Another option, of course, is mechanical control, which is just physically removing them, whether you're using seining nets, rakes, or hand pulling. But I will warn you, that is backbreaking labor. None of it is easy. So if you have, if you're someone who has younger children who you can put to work, you may want to consider that before you dive into it, because it does take a lot out of you. Biologically, you can use grass carp to try to eliminate things like chara. Though personally, I don't think it's a good idea to use grass carp at all. It is an introduced species that has gone invasive in several areas. If you've ever seen the YouTube video of someone driving a boat through a river and then all of a sudden they're just being hit by fish jumping out, those are grass carp. They're a major problem. So my opinion on it is let's avoid using them altogether. Let's try some of these other methods first. All right, so our submerged plants, like I said, I threw a little bit in here on this topic, not a whole lot though. So I've got a couple of plants here, Eurasian water milfoil. This is an invasive plant that most likely entered a lot of water because honestly, someone probably dumped their aquarium into a water supply and this plant reproduced and spread, unfortunately. Another one that's a part of our submerged plant is our curly leaf pondweed, which is fairly common. This one I believe is native, though I need to double check that to be sure. So the thing about submerged plants is that a lot of them are invasive and they will very readily spread very quickly. So the best thing to do to prevent their presence is one, do me a favor, get them all identified. We have extension educators in every county in Indiana. We can identify these plants for you so that way you know what the proper steps to take. Don't make the assumption, because if you do, you might be just burning your own money. So just go ahead, get it identified. We are here to help you. The best things to do is to do prevention through sanitation, i.e. let's not dump our aquariums in the water, and let's make sure that when we go to different water sources, we're cleaning off the clothes we used for it or the boat hulls that when we took our boats through those waters. And of course, controlling our runoff, just like with the algae. Now, chemical removal, there are several different chemicals that you can use with this, including 2,4-D. However, I would also, if you have a major problem with one of these plants, I would recommend that you consider calling a pond professional on this one to maybe get a plan put together with some professionals who know how to do proper applications and things like that, because these plants are so bad for our water systems. All right, free-floating plants. This is the next worst offender that I see in my work. This is going to include plants like our duckweed and our watermeal. So free-floating plants do not root into any kind of soil in the water. They are going to float right at the top, and they may or may not have roots. Oftentimes, these plants are able to absorb all the water and nutrients through their surface because they're just built that way. They're easily permeated by these things sitting on top of the water. Unfortunately, they are spread incredibly easy. This is a close-up picture of watermeal, I believe, or no, duckweed, I'm sorry. This is a close-up picture of duckweed. And what'll happen is, let's say you put your foot in the water and you take it out, and now your clothes are covered in duckweed, or you'll drive your boat through it. Now the boat hull is covered in duckweed, and then you move to another water source. This is where we get our major problems with these plants. And of course, they can spread across the surface of the entire pond. There is nothing restraining them except the amount of nutrients and the amount of sunlight they can get. So this is just another image of duckweed, and it gives you a little bit of reference too, because that right there, I believe, is a Trichoptera, a caddisfly, sitting on top of the duckweed, rather comfortably even. So it gives you an idea of how tiny this plant is. And then for the next one, this is an even tinier plant called watermeal. Those are the little tiny plants interspersed between the bigger ones. The bigger ones, by the way, are duckweed. So that gives you another idea of exactly how tiny these are. So duckweed has a root. Watermeal does not have any kind of roots. They're just like a very tiny little leaf that sits on top of the water, and that's the entire plant. And as you can see, they can spread all over it very easily and very quickly. So, like I said, they stick to surfaces very easily, and they're also spread by wildlife too. A lot of our birds will migrate or move to different bodies of water, and that is another way that these plants spread all over the place. Chemically, you can treat these with diquat and fluridone, which come under several different brand names. And I have some documentation I can share with you after the fact. I don't have those brand names memorized at the moment. I think Sonar might be one of them. Um, the big thing that I want to really impress upon you when it comes to control of free floating plants is sanitation. If you go to a body of water that has one of these two plants, clean off everything that came in contact with the water so that way you don't spread it to your own water source. That's the easiest way we're going to control those, because I cannot tell you how quickly these spread. There was a client that I visited a few years ago who had a beginning infestation of this in one corner of his pond. I went back less than a week later and it had spread across the entirety of his pond. That's how quickly it goes. So please be mindful, do some sanitation, and let's try to not to spread it. Okay, so another group of plants, excuse me, that I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today are our root floating plants. Now, these are the ones that you might be a little more familiar with, at least it's more in our consciousness. These are going to be things like your lily pads and your other plants that look similar to that, but how unlike the ones that we've talked about already, they actually have a fully developed root system that goes all the way to the soil in the bottom of the pond. And then they're going to emerge out of the pond with either a leaf or a flowering part. So this group's going to contain members like water lilies, water shield, spatterdock, and American pondweed. They're going to have floating flowers, so they do flower, they will be pollinated, etc. And they'll have leaves that float. But when you look past them into the water surface, you're going to find a stem connected to a root system that is very, very oddly spongy. If you grab onto it, it'll almost feel squishy, but it's incredibly strong too, making them a real challenge to pull. And they're also rhizomal, which means that if you see the stem's going to go in the ground and then it's going to run along the ground until it becomes another plant poking out. So instead of having multiple, say, water lilies, you actually only have one that has multiple leaves and flowering parts on it, and it's spread all over the bottom of the water. These plants can be valuable to wildlife, and we've all seen the picture in our head of the frog sitting on the lily pad. However, that benefit comes at a cost because these leaves are large, they cover a lot of surface area, and they're going to block access to sunlight for other plants that are under the surface of the water that are just as important to the wildlife in the water as the wildlife on top of it. So a little bit closer look now. This is an example of water lilies, which I'm sure a lot of you have already seen. They're very, very durable plants. If you grab onto a leaf, you'll kind of feel that. And the root systems and the stems under the water are going to be spongy, but they're also going to be very, very strong and very difficult to pull. Water shields are very similar to that, though they are less aesthetically pleasing. And you will find that, yeah, the leaf is on the surface there. And then you can, if you look at one of the leaves, you can see the center of it is where all of the veins in the leaf are connecting. That's also under the surface of the water where the stem is connecting to that leaf and leading down into probably a larger mass that connects to the root. So a lot of those leaves will be attached to the same plant. This is also going to be especially true for American pondweed. This really demonstrates it. You could see multiple stems with leaves attached to it. All of those stems are leading down to a central root system that's rooted under the surface in the soil underneath the water of the pond. Now, this should actually be labeled as general management tactics for all of these plants. So the best ways we can manage them are going to be through prevention, sanitation as usual. So we want to make sure we're cleaning off tools, we're cleaning off vehicles and clothing before we move on to different bodies of water. We also want to make sure that we try to tackle these early. If you don't want these plants in your water, you need to take care of them the minute they appear because they're difficult to remove mechanically, though it is possible. And there are some chemical options that you can apply to them, but those chemicals are going to be much more effective early on in the process. They're going to be able to take out younger plants much more easily. Now, here's the thing. There really is only one chemical that works very well on these surface root floating plants, and that's going to be glyphosate. But you must, if you're going to take this option, you must get a glyphosate product that is labeled for use in water. You're not going to take the bottle of Roundup you have in your garage that you use on your yard and take it out there to the pond and use it. It won't work the way you want. It'll be way too intense and it'll ultimately damage the pond. So you're going to have to get something that is labeled for the water. That way you can safely remove these plants and not damage plants that you want to keep. Mechanically, I mentioned you can remove them, you can pull them. But like I said earlier, the stems and roots of these plants are surprisingly strong. It's going to be a lot in terms of labor. So tackling these early is going to be your best option. All right, that is what I had for all of you on weeds. So the one thing that I also wanted to include is that there are a lot of weeds that I may not have mentioned in the short time we've been talking. So what I want you to do is if you have one that you're not sure what it is and you want to know what to do, bring it to us. Bring it to your local extension office. Mine in Owen County is right across from the Armory in Spencer, Indiana, and in Clay County, we're located on the fairgrounds on 59. And I have people who will bring me a 5-gallon bucket of weeds from their pond they want them identified. And that is what I am more than happy to do for you. Let's get them identified so that way you can know the right options and the right treatments that you can use to try to get rid of them. I've got my contact information displayed on the screen in front of you and the numbers for both my offices and my email, as well as links to our Purdue Ed Store and the Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab. All right, so with that, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.